See, and yeah, I needed to learn. At least I've made that mistake now and not another time. Where was I? Variability. You have to realize I don't do this with a script. I've got like some very brief notes here, and that's about all I run with. Because being ADHD as well, I operate best on the by the seat of my pants. You know that idea, that phrase. You know, just kind of always on the verge of chaos. That's where I'm at my best, and it's great. You know, I mean, it's fun, but you know, things can fall apart very quickly, as you just found. Let's go back to where I was, though. We were talking about variability and we were talking about the difference between hyper and hypo. But variability is more than that, of course. There is the variability in what senses we are actually sensitive to, because that's not a blanket truth either. And I think every autistic person has, I suppose, what you could call a sensory profile. Just you could almost graph it out if you wanted to, and you identify right. So this person tends to be hypersensitive to this some of the time. They tend to never really be bothered by this. That's fair enough. And they're always really hyposensitive with this particular thing. You could do that for pretty much any autistic person around. And I would always recommend that people do, you know, especially in workplaces and in schools and things like that. You know, a key part of a school student's, you know, individual action plan, you know, individual kind of, you know, school passport or whatever you want to call it, should, in my opinion, be a really detailed sensory audit, if you like, or sensory profile, which outlines where they're likely to find the challenges. Um, some schools do it, some schools don't. In my ideal world, of course, they all would. But the reason this is important is because, yeah, we don't have a blanket sensory experience at all. I'll just talk a little bit about mine, just because that's what I can talk about with some confidence. My sensory profile is very much heavily weighted towards touch and sound. Okay, they're by far the two that affect me the most. When it comes to touch, I also include in that temperature and humidity, and you know, being wet from the rain and stuff like that. That all comes under touch for me, and all of it is very difficult for me. So clothes fitting, you know, being touched by somebody unexpectedly, handshakes, hugs, those kind of things are very tricky for me. I find temperature to be I mean, if you might have read one of my books, I talk about it a lot. You know, I need the temperature to be within a very narrow window to be okay. Um, and yeah, you know, if things go wrong in that regard, I struggle and my ability to cope decreases dramatically. You know, you can almost see the meter kind of dropping as you know, the more I suffer from whatever the experience is. Sound is similar. I'm really sensitive to sound pretty much always, unless, and this is crucial, it's sound that I can predict or that I've chosen. Here's another one of those elements of inconsistency that people pick up on. So, for example, yeah, sound is a huge source of bother for me. But for you know several years, I was in a band playing music loudly on stage. I still play guitar today. I listen to music probably louder than I should on my headphones. You know, what's the story there? What's the deal with that? I think it's to do with autonomy. I think it's to do with expectation. Because if I'm honest with you, I still do get a bit of a jolt if I'm listening to something on headphones and a really loud song suddenly comes on random shuffle, you know, because I didn't expect it. And it's like, oh, okay. But even then, it's a song that I know, it's a song that I like, so I can cope with it. That's fine. I can cope with the noise of being in a band on stage with the loud guitars and the amplifiers because I've chosen to be here. It's expected. I haven't climbed on stage expecting it to be as peaceful and calm as a monastery. You know, I know it's going to be loud, and therefore I'm okay with it. It's to do with autonomy. I mean, this is a whole other topic for a talk, really, autonomy and autism. I think that the drive and the desire and the need for autonomy for autistic people may well be higher, maybe, than it is for the non-autistic population. I don't know. I don't want to make sweeping statements or judgments, but I think autistic people really we seek it and we need it in so many different ways. And I think sensorally it works like that too. You know, if I've got a car idling on the road outside my house, I didn't choose that. I'm not prepared for that, and it's bugging me horribly. You know, so there we go. When it comes to the other senses, I'm not too bad. Smell, I'm fine with good smells as long as they're not too strong. But if there's a bad smell of any kind, then I can't rest until it's been eradicated. That's definitely a thing for me. Taste, I don't have any taste issues, which I don't think is common for autistic people. Nearly every autistic person I know has, significant issues with food, taste, texture in the mouth, that kind of thing. And as you probably know, that can lead to, eating disorders and all kinds of things potentially in certain circumstances. I don't seem to have them. I don't know why. Alexandra's saying, I don't have significant taste issues. I seek it. Yeah, seeking those tastes, seeking those flavors, seeking being hyposensitive perhaps and needing more chili. Give me more chili. That kind of thing. And when it comes to things like vestibular and proprioception, I think I've actually got a fairly, I think I am hyper aware of proprioception. I always feel like I know exactly where I am. And weirdly, this is going off piece completely. I don't even know what this is called. I always know what time it is. Anyone else got that? Like you're not looking at your phone or a clock or anything, and time passes, and you think to yourself, I reckon it's about 4 o'clock. And then you look at your watch and it's like, or your phone, it's like, it is 4 o'clock. I don't know how that works. Which is interesting because I know that for some autistic people, it's the opposite, where, I think it's often given that term, which I don't think is the best term because it's appropriating another disability, but time blindness. So you've probably come across that. I don't think it's the best wording. I think we've got better wording for it now. I just can't remember what it was right now, but being very unaware of what time it is, just totally blissfully, well, maybe not blissfully, but totally not knowing the time at all. So it makes me, I don't know what that would come under. Is that like a weird form of proprioception, like knowing the time? I don't know. I'm not a scientist. I don't know, but it's a very interesting thing for me. So yeah, that's seeking, being sensory seeking. Autistic people who love roller coasters, who live for thrill rides, because it's a vestibular thing. Wanting that vestibular thrill of fast movement and spinning round and round and all that kind of thing. Whereas then you've got autistic people who would rather eat coriander and Stilton cheese than get on a roundabout. It's all the same thing. Hyper, hypo, and that different profile. Okay, I'm just keeping an eye on the time because as I know I do these talks a lot. My day job these days really is doing this kind of thing for, schools and companies and government and that kind of thing. And I'm always aware that the time always seems to be ticking away far faster than I want it to. So when we come to autistic sensory profiles, it's important to try and get a handle on the sensory profile of whoever the person is that we're trying to support. And if you yourself are autistic, this might sound a bit weird, but a bit of time spent, especially if you've only recently been diagnosed, a bit of time spent trying to identify your own sensory profile is time well spent. Because you're not going to, if you get diagnosed, you don't magically become the, instantly totally aware of everything about you that's autistic. It takes time. Especially because, let's face it, you get diagnosed and you don't really get told very much. You're not really helped out, especially in the UK. You just I was just waved out the door. They gave me a pamphlet and a few photocopied sheets of paper that were already outdated. So a bit of time spent really drilling down into, well, no, not drilling, it's too noisy. But really trying to get your head around, what your sensory profile is time very, very well spent. Because then, of course, you've got the potential to be able to then say to people, look, can we do this? Can we do that? At work, can we have accommodations or adjustments here, please? And so on and so forth. The other thing I think that is true about autistic sensory experiences, how we talk about it, it fluctuates, it changes, it's always in flux, it's very nebulous. I know for a fact that in my case, it definitely does get worse with stress. The more stressed I am, the more I struggle with this stuff. I don't know whether, because there's two ways this could go. I don't know whether it's worse because the stress is worsening the actual sensitivity, like making me more sensitive, or whether it's more simple, I suppose, and that the stress is just making me less patient and less able to cope with the sensitivity that's already there. Does that make sense? So either the stress makes the sensitivity change, or it just affects my ability to be resilient. I hate that word, resilient. I'm going to change that. It affects our ability to cope with that sensory input. I don't know the answer to that. I think for me, a lot of the time, it feels more like it's just my coping strategy. And I struggle to cope when I'm stressed. Like, we do, don't we? The more stressed we are, the more we struggle to manage things that add stress to our lives. Because, of course, the elephant in the room that I haven't even mentioned yet is the impact of all of this sensory stuff going on. And it's stress. It's enormous, enormous stress, especially with the hypersensitivity. You know, it just, the analogy I remember giving in one of my books, and I can't remember which one it was. I was sitting in a coffee shop and just kind of taking in all the sounds and realizing just how unfiltered my brain is, and how my brain really doesn't have any ability to decide that that noise doesn't matter or that noise doesn't matter. It's like my brain's like a hoarding thing, you know, just taking in everything that it can hear and being like, yeah, this is all gold. This is all really useful, crucial stuff. And I'm like, no, it's not. I don't want to care that much about the sound of the coffee machine. I don't want to hear that conversation between those two people over there. That's rude. You know, I don't want to hear this stuff. I want to filter it all out, and not being able to. And just that assault on your ears of just so much noise is extreme. And you know, my stress levels absolutely rocket. And I think this is particularly important when we think about kids in school. If any of you have autistic kids, you know, who go to you know, who are in education, because I can't think of many more stressful sensory environments than a school. I mean, there are obviously building sites, airports, you know, they discos. they exist, but we all have to go to school, don't we? You know, everyone's kind of forced to go to school, and therefore it affects everybody. And you know, there's like, you know, hundreds of thousands of, you know, children in schools every single day, many of whom are autistic and many of whom will be experiencing enormous stress. So we've got a situation where we've got loads and loads of kids in stressful sensory environments getting more and more and more stressed. And of course, what then happens? Well, as we all know, if you're really stressed, you don't necessarily make the right decisions. You might have a tendency to lash out. You might have a tendency to be irritable or just in a bad mood, to do things that you wouldn't normally do, etc., 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 until you're expelled. That's, you know, that's the pipeline, isn't it? Especially in British schools at the moment. And I think that is something that really, I mean, I'll talk more about this when I do my education talks later in the year. But I think that's something that we as a society are getting horribly wrong. You know, it's bad enough having to go to work and it be a sensory nightmare, but you know, to an extent, at least we're adults. Maybe we do have some, you know, autonomy to be able to make some changes for ourselves, even without anyone knowing. Maybe we have the ability to leave our workplace at lunchtime and find somewhere quiet. You know, we can do that. Kids can't. School children can't do that. They haven't got the freedom or the often the experience or the kind of gumption to ask their teachers for things to be changed. You know, they're kind of stuck. They're stuck in there. They might not be able to make changes. And what we need to do is make sure that all autistic children, so if you have a child that's autistic, that you bring that topic up, you know, with your school, which I know won't necessarily be easy or indeed lead to much, especially with secondary schools. But, you know, have that discussion and talk about the sensory environment and talk about the need for being able to lower that stress, you know, because the more you're exposed, the more high your stress goes. The only way to solve that is to find somewhere where the sensory overwhelm isn't there so that your stress levels can start to drop again. You know, do. And then you go back into the classroom, and yeah, they're going to rise, but at least they've been lowered a bit. You know, it's that whole thing, isn't it? About we always expect lunchtime. You know, I remember when I was a teacher, there was this expectation that after lunch, kids would come back rested, whatever that means. And autistic kids, of course, knew, unless unless you're in a particularly good school, because lunchtime is often the worst bit of the day in terms of sensory overwhelm, and they don't have anywhere to go. So yeah, yeah, we need to make sure that we're believing autistic experience, that we are that we're doing everything we can to identify what those sensory triggers are, and ensuring that wherever we possibly can, that sensory overwhelm is reduced, is brought down. Or to think about something like interoception, where hyposensitivity could be an issue, not knowing that you're hungry, not knowing that you're thirsty, that we're addressing that too. That we're, or people who are seeking sensory stuff. Because obviously in a classroom, an autistic student who's seeking sound, we could see how that could cause problems, couldn't we? A teacher wouldn't necessarily be very happy with an autistic student who's making noise because they want to hear noise. They're after that. I think it would be very difficult to make that teacher not want to tell them to shush, because it's a classroom and we've got to be reasonable. Everyone's in there to learn. But there's different ways of making that shush happen, aren't there? One where you're not aware of autistic sensory seeking and you're just telling this kid off because you think they're just being unnecessarily noisy for no reason, and you're horrible to them and you tell them to leave the classroom, etc. Or a situation where you understand all of this and you recognize that's what they're doing and you offer solutions. You can't do that right now, but maybe at break you go to the music room and smack the hell out of a piano or something. That's the kind of shift that we need to see. Anyway, before we go to Q&A, I just want to talk about one more thing, because I haven't mentioned masking. Because often people don't associate sensory stuff with masking, which is, in my opinion, that's wrong. You need to consider. Because if we go back to that idea of not being believed, if you're a kid, you keep telling your parents or your teachers that you've got sensory discomfort in X, Y, Z ways, and they tell you that you're wrong, Homer Simpson. No, it doesn't. What do you do? Well, you've got two choices, really. You can either start to disbelieve your own experience, literally be gaslighted into not believing your own sensory experience at all, which unfortunately is something that some autistic people do. And that has its own impact. Or you simply think to yourself, well, these people aren't going to help me, so I'm just going to have to pretend I'm fine. And that's the aspect of autistic masking that I think is often forgotten. Masking discomfort. We talk all the time about masking to please the other people and to mask on a communicative scale, make eye contact, make small talk, you learn the social cues and wear that mask. It's easy to forget that a lot of our mask, I think, is taken up just acting, trying to seem fine when you're really not. Because that if you were to pipe up and say, hey, I'm really not liking this, you're just going to get disbelieved, mocked, whatever happens. So you just end up tolerating stuff that you should not be tolerating. And I look back at my life as a young person, as a teenager, as somebody in their 20s, and that was the story. That was what I was doing. So often just tolerating stuff that I shouldn't have done, that was, corrosive to me, that was damaging my mental health, making me so stressed all the time, but just not able to address it because I knew no one would believe me. So, and of course, wherever possible, we need to be trying to minimize or lessen the need for an autistic person to mask within reason. It's very difficult to totally eradicate it, especially if you are in a demographic who's going to, find things to be very hostile if you don't mask. But where possible, we need to be reducing that, because we know that masking leads to bad outcomes and we don't want to go there. Anyway, it's 2045. That flew by, that did. Wow. It's like I start talking and it's like, oh, right, we're finished. Okay, well, we've got time for questions. So if anyone has one, you can either use the chat or you can, oh yeah, Sarah, you can use the hand up button and you whack your mic on. That's fine by me.
Hi Pete, how are you? Thanks so much. I thought that was brilliant. I'm a huge fan of you, so I've read a lot of your work. So it was great to hear your voice, and at a speaking event, it was great. Thank you very much. I was just wondering, do you have any experience in navigating opposing sensory needs? So, for example, in the parent-child kind of scenario, and also just around kind of holding that boundary, for yourself, but you also want to support your child. But then, if you do hold the boundary, like that can lead to a meltdown or it can lead to more dysregulation for your child, which then it's that feedback loop and that vicious cycle. If your child is dysregulated, then you're going to be dysregulated. And I just can't. I just don't know. I just don't think there's any easy answer. But I was just wondering if maybe you had any insights on that, please.
Yeah, I mean, it is a huge thing, isn't it? Ultimately, if you've got multiple autistic people in a family unit or in a classroom or in a workplace, you're going to have that clashing. You're going to, because we're all different. And yeah, I experience it. With my child. Fairly frequently. There's two types of clash. I think there's the more standard clash, which can happen with non-autistic people as well, where a person just happens to very often do the thing that you particularly find difficult, like you know having a baby that cries an awful lot, for example, is going to clash for an autistic parent who's got sound sensitivity. So that's one way that it can go. But then you've got the issue where you've got two autistic people whose actual needs clash massively because one is a sound seeker, just as an example, and the other person is sound sensitive. That's a nightmarish combination. So what can we do? Well, I mean, yeah, you're right. I mean, what can we do? It's very, very
Yeah.
difficult. All I would suggest, and all I've ever found that helped me, is just complete clarity and openness of conversation. The minute that everyone in the situation is old enough to be able to hold that conversation, you start having it, and
Yeah.
start to say, look, dad, daddy can't cope with this, just like you can't cope with this. So you start to kind of negotiate things, and it takes time, and you really have to kind of commit to it. But in a family unit, I think it is possible then for us to establish the reality of the sensory experience within the household.
Yeah.
Just knowing really fundamentally everyone, like your child's sensory profile, but they know yours. And obviously, when they're four, they might not be able to act on that very well. But by the time they're 8 or 9, they maybe are
Yeah.
able to take it into account a little. And then by the time they're teenage, well, I mean, all bets are off. But you never know. That there might be some really then fundamental understanding because in any household, non-autistic household, there are understandings about what people will tolerate. That don't have to be to do with behavior or anything. Like, you might know, for example, your mum wants the doors closed all the time. Were you born in a barn? Close that door. And that becomes just part of the natural ecosystem of the house. So it's about maybe trying to make sensory stuff like that, like just embedded. That if you're a sensory seeker and you need to make noise, that's fine. But maybe you have to wait for a bit. Maybe you have to go over there. Maybe just wait for me to put my ear defenders on, or just have that open communication. But that's
Yeah.
not it's not perfect, but it's
Yeah.
the best thing I've found.
And
Um,
even for him, like he's only 5, but it's actually a stim. A lot
yeah,
of his stims are
yeah,
related to a sensory need. So this is a stim. So a lot of the times he's not even conscious of it, that
yeah,
he's even
yeah.
doing
That's
it.
true.
And
Yeah,
and then the more you talk about it, it actually makes it worse. So anyway, yeah,
that,
but
that that's
thank
that,
you.
that's a fair point. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. In which
It's
case,
so tricky, like,
yes, yeah. As is so often the case, there's no easy answer. I mean, with stims, it's always difficult to suggest, people take up other stims because they might simply not work.
mm,
If a stim works, it works, for regulation. But if it's triggering other people, then yeah, it's a tricky thing to navigate. I wish I could be
yeah.
more helpful, but
No, no, it's
you
fine. Thank you.
know,
That was
thank you.
good. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thanks, Sarah. I'm just going to check the chat because it's absolutely rammed on there. So just bear with me for a second. What have we got? What have we got? What have we got? Let me just close participants. Right. Bum bum bum. Oh yes, the question of did somebody ask, do things getting worse as you get older? I'm sure I saw that.
Yes, I did that. Hang on, let me turn my video on. Hello,
Hello.
thank you. Yes, I used to tolerate an awful lot of things that I can't tolerate anymore.
Yeah.
Somebody suggested that it could coincide with the menopause, and the timing for that would be right. But also I think it might have coincided with going into autistic burnout.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely, because it's interesting. I think somebody actually, I saw the comment pop up. Somebody mentioned something about it might have been that that masking, because often, I mean, we know, for example, that autistic people can mask things from themselves. You know, like anyone who's late diagnosed knows that. You know, you've masked it from yourself for years. And I think that partly that can be sensory stuff too. You know, you can be masking your discomfort from yourself, and or or just not able to accept it and just thinking, no, I should be able to deal with this, so I'm going to. But of course, that will eventually end. You can't sustain that forever. And that is partly burnout, it's partly just natural sustenance. You just can't sustain it. You know, at some point, sooner or later, you will reach the point where you just say, I can't deal with this anymore, actually. And it all falls apart. I think there is something to be said for sensory things getting more sensitive as you get older. I've come across that a lot. I've come across that for quite a number of people who have said, you know, their visual sensitivity for brightness, for example, or taste has got stronger with age. So I think there is something to be said for that. But I also think, yeah, you're just gonna, you know, I suppose that natural part of aging of just I can't deal with this nonsense anymore. You know, I just don't want to have to deal with this. I think that kicks in, and you realise you're less tolerant of it because you've dealt with it all your life and you're fed up, quite frankly.
Yeah, because I worked as a sound engineer effectively. So you had to be listening to what was coming through the speakers and
Yeah.
listening to what people were telling you. And you know, it could be a bit annoying at times, but I totally coped with that.
Yeah.
And now, like if I'm trying to listen to a conversation and there's music, I can't tolerate it. If I'm trying to listen to music and there's conversation, I can't tolerate it. If I'm watching the telly and there's a car beeping reverse outside or something, you know, anything other than what I'm trying to listen to just drives me nuts.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I felt the same thing. You know, I feel like I'm more sensitive to especially touch, you know, temperature differences and humidity, way more sensitive now than I used to be as a kid or a teenager. And I don't know whether I was just masking it or whether it's very literally got more difficult. But yeah, you're not alone. Not by a long shot. So yeah, that is fairly standard. Okay, thanks, thanks, Jim. I'm just going to look through the other questions. Somebody asking, is the talk I'm doing in April aimed at bosses or for autistic people? It's going to kind of be both, really. You tend to be able to hit both. It's going to be given with the understanding that there will be autistic people involved, to be honest. So yeah, it'll be a bit of both. Anyway, moving on. Does anyone have any sensitivity to biology, talking about the body, blood? Is it linked to that huge imagination, hypersensitivity? That's an interesting one, isn't it? Yeah, like squeamishness, blood and gore and that kind of thing. That's interesting. Is that a sensory thing? Or is it to do with, very fertile imagination? And I don't know the answer to that, but I love it as a concept. Like, what's going on there? I think for me, I don't like gore at all. I don't like horror films that are gory one bit. I like creepy, I can do creepy ghosts and stuff, but I can't do gore. And I think it is partly visual because it's just gross and icks me out. Does that count? I'm not sure, but it's a good question. What else have we got? Since having a child, I feel less able to mask. Yeah, I know that feeling. I think the likelihood of being diagnosed as an adult after having a child is very common. People often talk about being diagnosed as an adult because your child is diagnosed, but actually I think it also happens just because you happen to have a child, and just the nature of becoming a parent is such a massive upheaval and such a massive change that that's what happened to me. That was my story. Anna's saying, I'm interested in finding out more about the need for autonomy in autistic people. Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. Yeah, it's something that I think you'll be able to find out about. It's well worth, actually. I mean, PDA is a tricky thing because people have very strong views on what it consists of and what it really is, and I don't want to get into the controversy of that. But looking into the existence of PDA is an interesting entry point into that idea of autonomy and that idea of being free to live our own lives without being imposed upon by others. It's certainly something to look into. But
I'm just wondering is there a crossover between autonomy and what seems to be innate in Charlie, who's my teenager, not to want or need or look for social interaction, and to be, quite self-contained and quite content to be self-contained.
Yeah.
And then, looking for input into, what's to be done. Is anything to be done? So I just think that might have hit a kind of nerve for me.
Yeah.
So it's something I haven't thought about before. And thanks, by the way. It's really been a really nice experience this evening. I came across you on LinkedIn. Yeah, I came across you on LinkedIn recently. So it's just really nice the way in which you articulate the autistic experience, and you do it so accurately and carefully and considered. It's such a nice experience to have that kind of articulated back to you. That in and of itself is a huge thing, because it's quite not really that common. Even with experts, or like we have a brilliant OT at the moment. I'm based in Ireland. I'm based in Galway, and we have CAMs here the same as in the UK. And the OT that I currently have for Charlie, Charlie's 15, is exceptional. But I'm kind of like nervous that she's going to leave any day now, any day soon. You know how it is when you get an expert that you love. But anyway, yeah. So I just wanted to say thanks.
Well, thank you. I mean, just going back to the autonomy thing, there is another aspect of autonomy which might be interesting for everyone, really. It's also worth bearing in mind that the drive for autonomy may well stem from that stress that I was talking about, because it's not that different to our need for routine. People often talk about autistic need for routine as if that is something inherent to autism, but I think it's more complicated than that. I think anyone who's constantly bombarded and stressed out by the sensory environment, but also by communication breakdowns and differences, because our communication style is different and it causes all kinds of problems. There is a tendency then, I think, to just want to, you want routine, you want things to feel familiar, you want things to feel like you've done them before, so it's safe and you're not going to get, unexpected criticism or a sudden argument appear from nowhere. But also you're going to want to do your own thing because you're in control of you, and you don't like other people being in control because they're kind of fundamentally chaotic and unpredictable. So you want to just look after yourself. You want to do your thing. I think that's at play as well, and it will make sense for that to peak perhaps in teenage years just naturally because you're establishing an identity and you are becoming you. So yeah, that might be worth looking into. Perhaps. Thanks, Anna. I'm just going to look at other questions. So, any ideas why crying sends someone into complete meltdown, yet seeks other sounds, loud sounds, and maybe would you know any suggestions on similar sounds? It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, crying. There's all sorts of theories about, like biologically, there's something about crying that does something to us, isn't there? Which is why, hearing a baby crying in a restaurant or on an aeroplane is so much worse, for example, than hearing somebody drop a load of plates. They're both fairly loud, probably quite short-lived, but something about the baby crying is worse. I think it's a kind of hardwired evolutionary thing, to care that there's a baby crying in the same way that you might react badly to hearing a wolf howling in your garden, like a very innate kind of but beyond that, I don't know. I mean, ultimately what we have there again is the not sought after sound versus the sought after sound, the surprise sound versus the I want this sound and it's on my terms. And autistic people who are sensory seeking in any way, whether it's proprioception, like with weighted blankets, or whether it's loud music for sound, or you know, really brightly coloured stuff for people who are sensory seekers for visuals or whatever. You experiment and you find what really hits the spot. You know, what really works. You know, like finding just the perfect consistency squidgy toy that just really works for your again, I suppose it's proprioception and touch, isn't it? You know, that just really works for you. It's a trial and error thing. You know, you find what works. But the good thing about sensory seeking, a bit like stimming and a bit like special interests, it's regulatory. It can really, really help regulate all those stress levels. You know, and anything that can help regulate that is always going to be good. So it's worth figuring out what those might be. Rachel's saying the lack of empathy myth is so annoying. Oh, indeed. And isn't it interesting that, I mean, this is Dr. Damien Milton's double empathy problem, isn't it? Where autistic people are told that we don't have empathy. And it's interesting, and actually, by its very nature, saying that autistic people don't have empathy, guess what that is? That's not having empathy, is it? What an ironic, paradoxical thing that is. But it goes beyond that. You know, it's this whole idea that basically the only reason people don't think we have empathy is because we don't empathize in the same way. You know, we don't necessarily know how to show empathy. I haven't got a blooming clue. I feel it, you know, I feel it till the cows come out, but I've got no idea what to do with it. I'm always worried I'm going to come across as really awkward or weird or creepy or whatever. You know, I don't know what to do. What do you do? I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry to hear that. It feels so false. I'm feeling that, but just saying it like that, it doesn't seem to reach the magnitude that it requires, if that makes sense. You know, I'd rather just sit quietly with a person, but that doesn't seem to be acceptable. So it's just a nightmare. You can see where the myth comes from. But again, it's a nice example of the worst possible interpretation of a person's behavior. And it's always, if you work around autism or you work with autistic people, you yourself are autistic, a very fun game to play, and I mean that sarcastically, is looking for examples of people making the worst possible assumption about you based on something you've done. So, for example, you don't make eye contact. Now, it's entirely possible that someone could interpret that simply as they don't like making eye contact. That is totally doable. But that doesn't happen. Instead, it's assumed that you're a liar. It's like, whoa, you know, calm down. That's such a massive jump. But that's what autistic people get all the time. You know, you're seeing stimming and nobody sits there and kind of thinks to themselves, oh, that person's moving in a regular rhythmic way. I wonder what that's about. Fair play to them. They assume that you're drunk or on drugs or something horrible. It's just, it's bizarre. I don't know what the deal with that is, but the people leap to the worst possible conclusion all the time. So yeah, that's not fun. Anyway, it's 9:05. I don't want to hold anyone else up. I certainly don't want to hold myself up because I've just realized I'm really hungry because, you know, obviously it takes me a while to realize it. And now I've realized I really am. That's interoception for you. So all I want to say is thank you to everyone who's come to this and who's stuck around as well. We've still got over 30 people here, which is impressive, considering we're 5 minutes over time. So thank you very much, everybody, for popping along. I will say, because I may as well, I do more of these, or I am going to do more of these on the Eventbrite page. Some are paid for, but I'm going to be doing some more free ones as well. And I've got to try to earn a living, haven't I? So have a look. And obviously, if you haven't read my books, then I would certainly recommend that you do. I'll just end with that. But thank you so much. I'm going to end the recording now. And yeah, feel free to go. Thanks for all the comments. That's really nice. Thank you very much. Or somebody in South Africa, it's 11:05. Oh my word, get to bed. It's late. Cheers, everyone. Thanks so much for coming along. And I'll see you hopefully again another day. Bye-bye.